A sheriff's fist slams a paramedic, but he doesn't know the woman bleeding inside holds a secret that could topple an empire. You won't believe how this ends. Before we dive in, drop a comment with your city. Where are you watching from? Smash that like button and subscribe for more jaw-dropping tales. Let's roll. The paramedic truck sped along the winding country road. Its red lights flashed brightly against the dusk sky. The siren wailed loud enough to rattle nearby windows. Inside, Emily Carter lay stretched out on the stretcher. Her breaths came fast and shallow. Sweat soaked her forehead as she pressed a trembling hand to her chest. Her husband, Daniel Carter, sat beside her. He held her other hand tightly. His eyes flicked between her pale face and the paramedic working nearby. "Stay with me, Emily," Daniel said. His voice shook slightly. He wiped her brow with his sleeve. "We're getting you help. You're strong. You can do this." Emily nodded weakly. Her lips parted as she tried to speak, but a sharp gasp cut her off. Pain tightened her grip on his hand. The paramedic, Lucas Reed, knelt close to the stretcher. He checked the monitor attached to Emily's arm. Her heart rate spiked again. He kept his face steady, hiding his worry. "We're almost at Westfield Hospital," Lucas said. "Hold on, Mrs. Carter. You're doing fine. Just keep breathing." Emily managed a faint smile. "Easier said than done," she whispered. Her voice cracked as another wave of pain hit. Daniel squeezed her hand harder. "You heard him. We're close. They'll fix this." His words sounded sure, but his eyes showed fear. He trusted Lucas. The paramedic's calm presence gave him hope. Lucas adjusted the oxygen mask over Emily's face. "The team's waiting for us," he added. "They know you're coming." His tone stayed even, meant to comfort them both. The truck jolted as it rounded a bend. Lucas steadied himself against the wall. He glanced toward the front, where the driver, Sarah Miles, gripped the wheel. She kept her focus on the road. The siren blared louder as they passed a cluster of trees. Daniel leaned closer to Emily. "Just a few more miles," he said. "We've got this." She closed her eyes, fighting to stay calm. Suddenly the truck slowed. The siren's pitch dropped. Daniel frowned. "Why are we stopping?" he asked. His voice rose with alarm. Lucas turned his head sharply. He peered through the small window to the cab. Sarah's hands tightened on the wheel. Ahead, a sheriff's patrol car sat parked across the narrow road. Its lights spun red and blue, blocking their path completely. "What's this?" Lucas muttered. He stood and moved toward the front. Emily groaned softly behind him. Daniel's jaw clenched. "Lucas, what's happening?" he demanded. "She needs the hospital now." Lucas held up a hand. "I'll find out. Stay with her." He kept his tone firm but soothing. The sheriff's door opened. A tall figure stepped out. Sheriff Victor Hayes adjusted his hat as he walked toward the truck. His boots crunched on the gravel. His face stayed hard, unreadable. Sarah lowered her window as he approached. "Sheriff, we're on an emergency run," she called out. "We need to get through." Victor stopped a few feet away. He crossed his arms. "You were speeding," he said. His voice carried a cold edge. "I clocked you going 15 over. That's reckless, emergency or not." Sarah blinked, stunned. "Sir, this is a medical call. We have a patient in critical condition." Lucas leaned forward from the back. "Sheriff, please," he said. "She's having chest pain. Every second matters. Let us pass." Victor's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, peering into the truck. "I don't care what's happening in there," he said. "Rules are rules. Show me your license and the truck's papers." Daniel shot up from his seat. "Are you kidding me?" he yelled. "My wife could be dying and you're worried about paperwork." Emily reached for him weakly. "Daniel," she murmured. "Don't." Her voice was faint, pleading. He ignored her, his anger boiling over. Lucas kept his hands visible. "Sheriff, we're legally allowed to speed in an emergency," he said. "This is a life-or-death situation. We don't have time for this." Victor's face tightened. "Don't tell me the law, kid," he snapped. "I enforce it. Papers. Now." The air grew heavy with tension. Emily's breathing turned ragged. Daniel glared at the sheriff. Lucas stayed still, weighing his next move. Sarah gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles pale. Outside, the patrol car's lights kept spinning, casting eerie glows across the scene. No one knew how far this would go. Sheriff Victor Hayes stood firm outside the paramedic truck. His shadow stretched across the gravel road. The spinning lights from his patrol car mixed with the truck's red glow, painting the trees in strange colors. Inside, Emily Carter's chest heaved with uneven breaths. Her hand slipped from Daniel's as she pressed it harder against her ribs. Pain carved deep lines into her face. Daniel's eyes burned with fury as he stared out at the sheriff. Lucas Reed kept his voice steady. "Sheriff, we're losing time," he said. "Her condition's getting worse. You're risking her life over a speed check." Victor tilted his head slightly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't take orders from paramedics," he replied. "You think you're above the law because of those lights. I decide who moves on this road." Sarah Miles, still in the driver's seat, turned to Lucas. Her voice dropped low. "He's not budging," she said. "What do we do?" Lucas glanced back at Emily. The monitor beeped faster now. Her heart rate climbed dangerously high. He clenched his fists, then faced Victor again. "Sir, I'm begging you," he said. "She's not stable. We need to go." Victor stepped closer to the open window. His hand rested on the truck's frame. "Begging doesn't change facts," he said. "You sped through my county. I've got a job to do. Hand over the papers, or you're not going anywhere." Daniel couldn't hold back anymore. He shoved past Lucas, leaning out toward the sheriff. "You're insane," he shouted. "My wife's dying in here. Move your car or I'll move it myself." Emily's weak voice cut through the noise. "Daniel, stop!" she gasped. "Please!" Her words barely reached him. Daniel's face flushed red. He pointed at Victor. "You hear that? She's suffering because of you." Victor's eyes darkened. He straightened up, his hand sliding to his belt. "Step out here and say that," he said. His tone turned icy. Lucas grabbed Danielle's arm. "Don't," he warned. "Let me handle this." Danielle yanked free, but he stayed inside. His chest heaved as he glared at the sheriff. Lucas turned back to Victor. "Sheriff, we're not fighting you," he said. "We're trying to save someone. Call the hospital. They'll tell you how serious this is." Victor smirked faintly. "I don't need a doctor's note," he said. "I need your license, now." The standoff stretched on. Emily's groans grew louder. Sarah checked her watch, then muttered to Lucas, "We're 10 minutes past when we should have arrived." Lucas nodded grimly. He reached for the truck's radio, hoping to call for backup. Before he could speak, Victor lunged forward. He grabbed Lucas's wrist through the window. "No calls," he barked. "You deal with me first." Lucas pulled back, startled. Pain shot through his arm where Victor's grip had tightened. "Let go," he said, keeping his voice level. "This isn't helping anyone." Victor released him, but didn't step away. "You're testing me," he said. "That's a mistake," Daniel exploded again. "Testing you? You're the one holding us hostage." He kicked the truck's wall in frustration. Emily's hand dropped limp onto the stretcher. Her eyes fluttered shut. The monitor screeched a warning. Lucas spun around, rushing to her side. "She's crashing," he yelled. "Sarah, get the defibrillator." Sarah scrambled to the back, pulling equipment from a cabinet. Daniel froze, his anger replaced by panic. "Emily, no," he whispered. "Stay with me." Lucas worked fast. He pressed pads onto Emily's chest, shouting orders to Sarah. The machine hummed as it charged. Victor watched from outside, his face unreadable. He took a step toward the truck's open door. "What's going on in there?" he demanded. Lucas ignored him, focused on Emily. "Clear," he called. Sarah stepped back. The jolt hit Emily's body. She jerked slightly, but the monitor stayed flat. Daniel's hands shook as he grabbed Emily's shoulders. "Come on," he pleaded. "You're tougher than this." Lucas tried again. Another shock. Still nothing. Sweat dripped down his face. Victor climbed into the truck, his boots heavy on the floor. "Answer me," he said. "What's happening?" Lucas finally snapped. "She's dying," he shouted, "because you won't let us move." Victor's jaw tightened. He grabbed Lucas by the collar, yanking him away from Emily. "Don't blame me," he growled. "You should have followed orders." Lucas stumbled, catching himself on the stretcher. Before he could recover, Victor swung a fist. It landed hard on Lucas's jaw. Blood sprayed from his lip as he fell against the wall. Sarah gasped, dropping the oxygen tank she'd grabbed. Daniel lunged at Victor. "You bastard!" he yelled. He tackled the sheriff, slamming him into the cabinets. Equipment clattered to the floor. Victor shoved Daniel off, his strength overpowering. "Stay down," he warned, raising a fist again. Outside, a distant rumble grew louder. Headlights flashed through the trees. Someone was coming. Lucas wiped blood from his mouth. He crawled back to Emily, ignoring the chaos. "Sarah, help me," he said. "We're not giving up." Sarah nodded, her hands trembling as she adjusted the monitor. The new lights drew closer. Tires screeched on the road. 2 pickup trucks pulled up behind the sheriff's car. Men in work vests jumped out, shouting. "What's going on here?" one called. "That's an ambulance." Victor stepped out, brushing off his uniform. "This is official business," he said. "Mind your own." The lead man, a broad-shouldered farmer named Henry Tate, didn't back off. "We heard the sirens stop," he said. "Saw the lights from the mill. Why's it parked?" His crew spread out, eyeing the scene. Daniel stumbled to the door, his face bruised. "He's killing my wife," he yelled. "Won't let us through." Henry's eyes widened. He marched toward Victor. "Move that car, Sheriff," he said. "Now." Victor squared his shoulders. "I'm in charge here," he replied. "Back off, or you're all under arrest." The tension boiled over. Lucas kept working on Emily. Her pulse flickered faintly on the monitor. Sarah whispered, "Come on, hold on." The farmers closed in, voices rising. Henry pulled out his phone, starting to record. "This is going live," he said. "Whole county's going to see this." Victor's hand twitched toward his gun. The night was about to crack wide open. Dust swirled around the paramedic truck as shouts echoed outside. Sheriff Victor Hayes faced the group of farmers, his hand hovering near his holster. Henry Tate held his phone steady, recording every move. The screen glowed bright in the dim light. His crew, 5 men in dirt-streaked vests, formed a loose semicircle around the sheriff's patrol car. Their faces showed anger and confusion. Inside, Lucas Reed pressed his hands against Emily Carter's chest, counting compressions. Blood trickled from his split lip. Sarah Miles adjusted the monitor, her eyes darting between Emily and the chaos beyond the door. Emily's pulse flickered weakly on the monitor. Lucas kept his rhythm firm. "Stay with us, Emily," he said, his voice strained but focused. Daniel Carter knelt beside her, his bruised hands gripping the stretcher's edge. "You're not leaving me," he whispered. Tears streaked his face. The machine beeped once, then twice. A faint heartbeat held on. Sarah exhaled sharply. "She's still in there," she said. "Keep going." Outside, Henry's voice boomed over the tension. "Sheriff, you're on camera," he said. "Let that truck go, or this video hits every screen in the state." Victor's eyes flicked to the phone, his jaw clenched tighter. "You're interfering with law enforcement," he replied. "Put that down, or I'll haul you all in." Henry didn't flinch. "Try it," he said. "We're not the ones blocking a dying woman." The farmers shifted closer. One, a wiry man named Pete, pointed at the truck. "We heard her husband," he said. "You're keeping her from the hospital. That's not right." Another, a stocky figure called Tom, stepped toward the patrol car. "Move it ourselves," he suggested, glancing at Henry. Victor's hand dropped to his gun. "Touch that car and you'll regret it," he warned. His tone carried a sharp edge. Inside, Lucas paused compressions to check the monitor. Emily's heart rate steadied, but barely. "We've got a chance," he said to Sarah. "But we need to move now." Sarah nodded, then looked out at the standoff. "They're not helping," she muttered. Daniel stood, wiping his face. "I'll make them," he said. He staggered to the door, his voice raw. "Henry, get him out of the way, she's fading." Henry turned, locking eyes with Daniel. "We're trying," he called back. He faced Victor again. "You heard him, Sheriff. She's dying. This is on you." Victor's face twitched. He took a step toward Henry, towering over him. "I don't answer to farmers," he said, "or crying husbands." He shoved Henry hard. The phone wobbled, but Henry caught his balance, still filming. Pete lunged forward. "That's enough!" he yelled. He grabbed Victor's arm. The sheriff spun, slamming his elbow into Pete's chest. Pete stumbled back, gasping. Tom charged next, tackling Victor against the patrol car. The thud echoed loud enough to reach the truck. Sarah winced. "This is getting bad," she said. Lucas kept working, his hand steady on Emily. "Focus here," he replied. "They'll sort it out." Victor wrestled free, shoving Tom to the ground. He drew his baton, raising it high. "Back off!" he roared. "All of you!" The farmers froze, but their glares didn't soften. Henry kept the camera rolling. "Keep going, Sheriff," he said. "Show the world who you are." Victor hesitated, the baton trembling in his grip. Headlights flared again in the distance. Engines growled closer. 2 more vehicles screeched to a halt, a rusted van and a sleek black sedan parked behind the farmers' trucks. Doors flew open. A woman in a deputy's uniform stepped from the sedan. Deputy Nora Klein adjusted her badge, her face stern. 3 men in hunting gear piled out of the van, rifles slung over their shoulders. The leader, a grizzled man named Carl, shouted, "What's the hold-up?" He spotted the paramedic truck and froze. Nora strode toward Victor. "Sheriff Hayes," she called. "Got a call about a blocked emergency vehicle. This you?" Victor lowered his baton, turning to her. "Deputy, this is under control," he said. "Emily sped through my zone. I'm handling it." Nora's eyes narrowed. She glanced at the truck, then at the farmers. "Handling it?" she asked. "Looks like a mess." Carl and his hunters moved closer. "Heard the siren from the ridge," Carl said. "Thought someone was hurt. Why's it stopped?" Daniel leaned out, his voice breaking. "My wife's dying in here," he yelled. "He won't move." Nora's head snapped toward Victor. "That true?" she asked. Victor squared his shoulders. "They broke the law," he said. "I'm doing my job." Nora walked to the truck's door. She peered inside, seeing Lucas and Sarah fighting to keep Emily alive. Her expression hardened. "Your job's to protect people," she said, "not stop them from getting help." Victor scoffed. "Don't lecture me, Klein," he replied. "I've got seniority." Nora ignored him, waving to Carl. "Help me shift that car," she said. Carl nodded, signaling his men. They moved toward the patrol car. Victor stepped in front, blocking them. "You're crossing a line," he warned. Nora didn't back down. "So are you," she said. "Stand aside or I'll report this myself." Henry's camera caught it all. The farmers joined Carl's crew, surrounding Victor. Outnumbered, he glared but didn't move. Inside, Emily's eyes opened briefly. She coughed, a weak sound. Lucas checked the monitor. "She's holding," he said, "but we're on borrowed time." Sarah grabbed the radio. "Westfield, this is Unit 7, she said. "We're delayed by a sheriff, patient critical, send help." Static crackled, then a voice replied. "Copy, backup's 5 minutes out." Victor heard the transmission, his face flushed with rage. He stormed back to the truck, shoving past Nora. "You're calling reinforcements," he yelled. He grabbed Lucas through the door, pulling him out. Lucas hit the gravel hard, groaning. Victor raised his fist again. "You'll pay for that," he snarled. Before he could strike, Carl tackled him from behind. The sheriff went down, cursing. Nora shouted, "Enough!" She pulled Carl off, then faced Victor. "You're done here," she said. "Move the car, or I'll do it." Victor climbed to his feet, wiping dirt from his face. He glared at the growing crowd. Henry's video streamed live, comments popping up online. The pressure closed in. Backup sirens wailed closer. Victor's grip on control slipped away. Dust swirled around the paramedic truck as Sheriff Victor Hayes stood, brushing gravel from his uniform. His chest heaved with anger. Deputy Nora Klein faced him, her stance firm. Henry Tate's phone stayed steady, streaming the chaos live. Comments flooded in, viewers demanding action. The farmers and Carl's hunters formed a tight ring around Victor's patrol car. Their voices mixed with the faint wail of approaching sirens. Inside the truck, Lucas Reed climbed back to Emily Carter's side, his jaw throbbing from the sheriff's blow. Sarah Miles adjusted the monitor, her hands quick but shaking. Emily's breaths rasped faintly. Her skin gleamed with sweat. Lucas pressed an oxygen mask to her face. "Hang on," he said. "Help's close." The monitor beeped erratically, her heart rate dipping low. Daniel Carter gripped her hand, his knuckles white. "You're not leaving me," he whispered. Tears streaked his face. Sarah glanced out the door. "Backup's almost here," she said. "We just need to hold out." Outside, Nora pointed at Victor's car. "Move it, Sheriff," she said. "This ends now." Victor wiped blood from his lip, glaring at her. "You don't give me orders, Klein," he replied. "I'm still in charge." Carl stepped forward, his rifle still slung but his presence heavy. "Not anymore," he said. "You've got 10 seconds." The hunters shifted, ready to act. Henry nodded at Pete and Tom. "Let's roll it ourselves," he said. They moved toward the car. Victor lunged, grabbing Pete's shoulder. "Hands off!" he barked. He swung his baton, catching Pete's arm. Pete yelped, stumbling back. Tom tackled Victor again, pinning him to the hood. Nora pulled her radio. "Dispatch, this is Klein," she said. "Sheriff Hayes is obstructing an emergency. Request immediate assistance." Static buzzed, then a voice crackled. "Units en route, 2 minutes." The farmers cheered faintly. Henry's stream lit up with support. "Take him down," one comment read. Victor shoved Tom off, scrambling to his feet. His eyes darted to the truck, then the crowd. "You're all breaking the law," he yelled. "I'll have every one of you locked up." Nora stepped closer. "You assaulted a paramedic," she said. "Delayed a patient. That's on you." Inside, Lucas checked Emily's pulse. It fluttered, weak but there. "She's slipping," he said. Sarah grabbed a syringe, injecting a stabilizer. "This'll buy us time," she said. Daniel's voice broke. "How much time?" he asked. Lucas met his eyes. "Enough if we move soon," he replied. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the shouts. 2 sheriff's SUVs roared up, skidding to a stop. Deputies spilled out, hands on their belts. A tall woman with grey hair stepped forward. Captain Ellen Ward scanned the scene, her face hard. "Hayes," she called. "What's this mess?" Victor straightened, brushing off his sleeves. "Captain, I stopped a speeding truck," he said. "They resisted. I'm enforcing order." Nora marched over. "He's lying," she said. "He blocked a critical patient, attacked the paramedic. Look at the video." She pointed at Henry, who held up his phone. Ellen's eyes narrowed. She turned to Victor. "That true?" she asked. Victor hesitated. "They exaggerated," he said. "I followed protocol." Ellen glanced at the truck, spotting Lucas's bloody face through the window. Her jaw tightened. "Stand down, Hayes," she ordered. "You're off this scene." Victor's face flushed red. "You can't do that," he said. "I've got rank." Ellen stepped closer, her voice low. "I've got authority," she replied. "Move, or I'll cuff you myself." The deputies flanked her, watching Victor. He glared, but stepped back, his hands clenched. Ellen waved to the farmers. "Clear that car," she said. Henry and Carl's crew rushed forward. They pushed the patrol car aside, tires scraping the road. The path opened. Sarah jumped to the driver's seat. "We're good," she called. Lucas secured Emily's stretcher. "Go," he said. The engine roared. The truck lurched forward, siren blaring anew. Daniel stayed with Emily, whispering to her. "We're moving," he said. "You made it." Her eyes stayed closed, but her chest rose slightly. Lucas wiped sweat from his brow, relief mixing with exhaustion. The truck sped past the SUVs, leaving the chaos behind. Ellen turned to Victor. "You're coming with me," she said. "This isn't over." Henry lowered his phone, ending the stream. "That's justice," he said. The farmers nodded, dispersing to their trucks. Cole's hunters climbed into their van, muttering about the sheriff. Nora approached Ellen. "He's got a history," she said. "I've seen him push people around before." Ellen nodded grimly. "We'll dig into it," she replied. "He's not walking away clean." The truck raced toward Westfield Hospital. Sarah kept her eyes on the road. Lucas monitored Emily, adjusting the oxygen. "She's stable for now," he said. Daniel exhaled, leaning against the wall. "Thank you," he said. "Both of you." Sarah glanced back. "We're not there yet," she replied. "Hold on tight." Back at the scene, Ellen ordered a deputy to secure Victor's car. "Take him to the station," she said. Victor climbed into an SUV, his face a mask of fury. The crowd thinned as the deputies took statements. Henry uploaded his video titled, "Sheriff Stops Dying Woman." It spread fast, igniting outrage online. Comments piled up, calling for Victor's badge. 5 miles away, a black car idled on a hill. A man in a suit watched the truck's lights fade. He picked up his phone, dialing a number. "It's Daniel Carter's wife," he said. "She's headed to Westfield. Hayes botched it." A voice replied, "Keep tabs on her. We need to know who she is." The man nodded, starting his engine. The night hid his face as he followed at a distance. At the hospital, the truck pulled into the bay. Doctors rushed out, wheeling a gurney. Lucas and Sarah transferred Emily, briefing the team. "Chest pain, cardiac arrest en route," Lucas said. "She's critical." The lead doctor, a woman named Dr. Patel, nodded. "We've got her," she said. They whisked Emily inside, Daniel jogging behind. Lucas sank against the truck, catching his breath. Sarah joined him, her face pale. "That was too close," she said. He nodded, touching his swollen jaw. "Yeah," he replied, "and it's not done." They watched the hospital doors close, unaware of the black car parking across the street. Someone bigger than Victor was watching Emily's fate unfold. The hospital doors swung shut behind Emily Carter's gurney. Doctors hustled her down the hall, their voices sharp with urgency. Daniel Carter followed, his shoes squeaking on the tile. His face showed exhaustion and fear. Lucas Reed and Sarah Miles stayed by the truck, leaning against its side. Lucas rubbed his bruised jaw. Blood stained his sleeve. Sarah stared at the ground, her hand still trembling from the ordeal. Outside, the black car idled across the street. Its driver watched through tinted windows, his phone pressed to his ear. Inside, Dr. Patel barked orders. "Get her to the cath lab," she said. "We need imaging now." Nurses wheeled Emily into a sterile room. Machines hummed as they hooked her up. Her chest rose faintly, her face pale under the bright lights. Daniel stood in the hallway, peering through a window. A nurse stopped him. "Sir, you need to wait out here," she said. He nodded, his throat tight. "Just save her," he replied. Back at the truck, Lucas pulled out his phone. "I'm calling it in," he said. Sarah looked up. "The sheriff?" she asked. Lucas nodded. "He assaulted me, delayed us. We can't let that slide." He dialed their supervisor, his voice steady. "Hey, it's Reed. We just got a patient to Westfield. Sheriff Hayes stopped us, hit me, almost cost her life." The line crackled. "File a report," the supervisor said. "We'll back you up." Lucas hung up, his eyes hard. Sarah glanced across the lot. "That car's been there a while," she said. She pointed at the black sedan. Its engine purred softly, headlights off. Lucas frowned. "Watching us?" he asked. Sarah shrugged. "Maybe the sheriff sent someone," she said. They kept their distance, uneasy. Inside the car, the man in the suit spoke low. "She's in the cath lab," he said. "No word on her yet." The voice on the phone replied, "Find out what they know. We can't lose her." At the sheriff's station, Victor Hayes sat in a holding room. His uniform jacket hung on a chair. Captain Ellen Ward stood outside, arms crossed. Deputy Nora Klein handed her a tablet. "Henry's videos everywhere," Nora said. "Over 1 million views. People want his head." Ellen scrolled through comments. "Sheriff should rot," one read. "Justice for the paramedics," said another. She looked at Victor through the glass. "He's got no idea what's coming," she said. Nora tapped the screen. "There's more," she said. Old complaints. 3 years back he roughed up a trucker. Last year he broke a kid's arm during a stop. All buried. Ellen's face darkened. "Someone covered for him," she said. "Not this time." She opened the door. Victor looked up, his eyes defiant. "Captain, this is a mistake," he said. "I was doing my job." Ellen tossed the tablet onto the table. "Your job doesn't include punching paramedics," she replied, "or killing patients." Victor leaned back. "They're blowing it up," he said. "I'll fight this." Ellen stared him down. "You won't win," she said. "Evidence is piling up. You're suspended. Investigation starts tomorrow." She walked out, locking the door. Victor slammed his fist on the table, his control unraveling. At the hospital, Dr. Patel studied Emily's scans. "Blockage in her left artery," she said to a nurse. "Prep for surgery." The team moved fast, wheeling Emily to the operating room. Daniel paced the waiting area, his phone buzzing. He answered. "Daniel, it's me," a voice said. It was his sister, Rachel. "I saw the video online. Is Emily okay?" Daniel's voice cracked. "She's in surgery," he said. "That sheriff nearly killed her." Rachel paused. Dad's on his way, she said. He's furious. Says he's calling in favors. Daniel frowned. Favors? He asked. Who's he talking to? Rachel hesitated. People he knows, she said. High up. This won't stay quiet. Daniel nodded, hanging up. He didn't know his father-in-law James Holt had ties that reached beyond their small town. Across town, James Holt sat in his study. His grey hair glinted under a desk lamp. He dialed a number, his voice calm but firm. It's Holt, he said. My daughter's in the hospital because of a sheriff. I want him gone. The man on the line replied, We'll handle it. What's his name? James answered, Victor Hayes, Westfield County. The voice said, Consider it done, but we need something from you. James gripped the phone. Name it, he said. Back at the hospital, Lucas and Sarah filed their report with a police officer. He grabbed me, hit me, Lucas said. Kept us there 20 minutes. The officer nodded, writing it down. We've got witnesses, he said. Farmers, hunters, a deputy. This'll stick. Sarah glanced at the black car again. It hadn't moved. Something's off, she whispered to Lucas. He agreed, his gut twisting. In the operating room, Dr. Patel worked with precision. Stents in, she said. She's stabilizing. The team sighed in relief. Emily's heart rate climbed slowly, steadying on the monitor. A nurse stepped out to update Daniel. She's through surgery, she said. Critical but alive. Next few hours matter. Daniel sank into a chair, his hands shaking. Thank you, he said. Outside, the black car's driver snapped a photo of the hospital entrance. He sent it with a message. She's out of surgery, alive for now. The reply came fast. Get inside. We need her records. The man slipped out, adjusting his tie. He walked toward the hospital, blending with visitors. Lucas spotted him crossing the lot. That's him, he said to Sarah. Let's follow. They trailed the man inside, keeping their distance. He moved toward the records desk, flashing a badge. Health inspector, he said. Need patient files. The clerk hesitated. Which one? She asked. The man smiled thinly. Emily Carter, he replied. Lucas and Sarah exchanged a look. He's no inspector, Lucas whispered. They stepped closer, ready to act. At the station, Ellen met with a state investigator. Hayes has a file, she said. Incidents go back years. This isn't his first mess. The investigator nodded. We'll pull everything, he said. Videos, reports, witnesses. He's facing charges. Ellen glanced at Victor's room. Good, she said. He thought he was untouchable. Henry Tate sat at home, uploading more footage. His phone buzzed with messages. You're a hero, one said. He smiled, but worry lingered. The video had sparked protests outside the station. Signs read, Jail Hayes and Protect Our Medics. The story grew bigger than he'd expected. Across the county, James Holt's call set wheels in motion. A news van rolled toward Westfield, reporters hungry for the scoop. In the hospital, the man in the suit slipped a file into his jacket. Lucas confronted him. Who are you? He asked. The man turned, his eyes cold. Walk away, he said. This doesn't concern you. Sarah grabbed her phone, dialing security. The man bolted, shoving past them. Lucas gave chase, adrenaline surging. The night's danger wasn't over yet. Glass crunched underfoot in the hospital hallway. The gunshot's echo faded, replaced by panicked shouts. Lucas Reed crouched behind a cart, his pulse racing. Sarah Miles pressed against the wall, her eyes wide. Officer Grant and his partner, Diaz, held their guns steady, scanning the stairwell where the man in the suit had fled. Patients huddled in doorways, nurses urging them back. Emily Carter slept in her room, unaware of the danger. Daniel Carter stood guard at her bedside, his fists clenched. Outside, sirens screamed closer. Grant lowered his radio. Backup's here, he said. Lockdown's in effect. Diaz nodded, peering down the stairs. He's gone deep, he said. Probably basement. Lucas stood, brushing off his knees. He's after Emily, he said. We can't wait. Sarah joined him, clutching Emily's file. This says she testified against a syndicate, she said. They want her silent. Grant frowned. Syndicate? He asked. Lucas nodded. Explains the fake inspector, he said. She's a target. Footsteps pounded up the hall. 4 more officers arrived, vests on, weapons drawn. A sergeant took charge. Secure the ward, she said. Grant, Diaz, sweep below. They moved out, leaving 2 guards at Emily's door. Lucas turned to Sarah. We need to tell Daniel, he said. They hurried to the room. Daniel looked up, startled. What's happening? He asked. Lucas kept his voice low. Someone shot at us, he said. They're after Emily. She's in deeper than we thought. Daniel's face paled. Who's after her? He demanded. Sarah handed him the file. She was Emily Reed, she said. Witness protection. Hid from a crime group. Daniel scanned the pages, his hands shaking. She never told me, he said. 10 years and nothing. Lucas glanced at the door. They found her now, he said. That sheriff's stop wasn't random. Daniel's eyes hardened. Hayes works for them? He asked. Sarah shrugged. Maybe, she said. Or he just gave them an opening. Outside the hospital, James Holt's car screeched into the lot. He jumped out, ignoring news vans swarming the entrance. Reporters shouted questions. Mr. Holt, is this tied to Sheriff Hayes? One yelled. He pushed past, racing inside. The lobby buzzed with cops and staff. He spotted Lucas and Sarah exiting Emily's room. Where's my daughter-in-law? He demanded. Lucas pointed. She's safe, he said, but someone's hunting her. James's jaw tightened. I know, he said. I'm here to stop it. At the station, Sheriff Victor Hayes paced his holding room. A TV flickered, showing the protests. Signs outside read, End Hayes Now. His phone sat confiscated on Ellen Ward's desk. She met with the state investigator Tom Vega in her office. We've got his record, Vega said. 5 complaints, all hushed up. Friends in high places kept him clean. Ellen tapped a file. Not anymore, she said. Assault, obstruction, tampering. He's done, Victor overheard through the door. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He tried wiping his dashcam earlier, but a deputy caught him. Evidence stacked high. Ellen opened his door. Hayes. You're charged, she said. Assault on a paramedic, endangering a civilian. Courts tomorrow. Victor smirked faintly. I've got people, he said. This'll blow over. Ellen leaned in. Your people can't save you now, she replied. Public's watching. Back at the hospital, the basement hummed with machinery. The man in the suit crept through shadows, gun ready. His phone vibrated. They've got her file, he said. I'm pinned. The voice replied, Finish it. Basement exit's clear. He moved toward a service door, but footsteps echoed behind. Grant and Diaz closed in, flashlights cutting the dark. Freeze! Grant yelled. The man fired twice, bullets ricocheting off pipes. Steam hissed as he ran. Upstairs, James burst into Emily's room. Daniel blocked him. What's going on? He demanded. James pushed past, kneeling by Emily. Her eyes fluttered open. James? She whispered. He gripped her hand. You're in danger, he said. I didn't know they'd come for you. Emily frowned. Who? She asked. James hesitated. People I owed, he said. From years ago. I thought it was over. Daniel grabbed his shoulder. You brought this on her, he yelled. James shook his head. Not on purpose, he said. I'm fixing it. Lucas and Sarah returned with the sergeant. Basement's hot, Lucas said. He's cornered. The sergeant nodded. Feds are inbound, she said. Witness protection breach. They'll take over. James stood, his face grim. I'll talk to them, he said. I know names. Daniel glared. You better, he said. She's my wife, not your pawn. Emily squeezed Daniel's hand. Stay with me, she murmured. He softened, nodding. Outside, Henry Tate led the protest to the hospital steps. Hayes isn't alone, he shouted through a megaphone. Who's pulling strings? The crowd roared, news cameras rolling. Online, his video hit 5 million views. Hashtag spread, save Emily, and expose the syndicate. Reporters swarmed James as he exited. Mr. Holt, what's your role? One asked. He ignored them, dialing his phone. It's me, he said. Call them off. I'll pay whatever they want. The voice laughed. Too late, it said. She talks. We're all dead. In the basement, Grant tackled the man in the suit near the exit. Diaz cuffed him, wrenching the gun away. Who sent you? Grant demanded. The man spat blood, silent. Steam clouded the air as they hauled him up. Upstairs, feds stormed in, suits crisp, badges flashing. Agent Carter took charge. Emily Reed's ours, he said to the sergeant. Secure her. We're digging into Hayes and Holt. Lucas and Sarah watched from the hall. This is huge, Sarah said. Bigger than we thought. Lucas nodded, touching his jaw. She's not safe yet, he said. Agent Carter approached. You two saw it start, he said. Testify? They agreed, resolute. Emily's room stayed guarded, but tension lingered. The man in the suit smirked as he was dragged past. You've got no idea, he muttered. James stepped outside, facing the crowd. I'll tell everything, he shouted. No more hiding. Protesters cheered, but his phone buzzed again. You're a dead man, the voice said. He paled, realizing the cost. Inside, Emily whispered to Daniel. I remember, she said. Names, faces. They'll kill me for it. Daniel held her close. Not if I stop them, he replied. At the station, Ellen found a hidden email on Victor's phone. Payment confirmed, it read. Target E. Reed. She showed Vega. He's their pawn, she said. Syndicate hit. Vega nodded. Trial's just the start, he replied. Westfield braced for a reckoning, the story exploding beyond a sheriff's mistake into a web of power and revenge. The hospital hummed with tension as federal agents swarmed the halls. Emily Carter's room stayed locked down, 2 feds at her door. Daniel Carter sat beside her bed, his eyes fixed on her fragile form. She stirred, her voice weak. Daniel, they're coming, she said. I saw too much. He squeezed her hand. They won't touch you, he replied. I swear it. Outside, Lucas Reed and Sarah Miles briefed Agent Carter in a cramped office. Papers from Emily's file littered the desk. Lucas pointed at a name. Vincent Cole, he said. Syndicate boss. She testified against him. Sarah nodded. 10 years ago, she added. He's out now, wants her gone. Agent Carter adjusted his glasses. We lost track of Cole, he said. He's got people everywhere. Hayes was one. Lucas clenched his fist. That's why he stopped us, he said. Set her up? Carter nodded. Likely, he replied. We've got the shooter. He's not talking yet. Downstairs, the man in the suit sat cuffed in a storage room. Grant and Diaz guarded him, their faces stern. Who's paying you? Grant asked. The man smirked, blood crusted on his lip. You'll find out, he said. When it's too late, Diaz leaned in. We've got your phone, he said. Calls to her burner. We'll trace it. The man's smirk faded slightly, but he stayed silent. A Fed entered, taking over. He's ours now, she said. They dragged him out, his eyes glinting with defiance. At the station, Captain Ellen Ward handed Tom Vega a flash drive. Hayes' emails, she said. Payments from a shell company. Orders to target Emily Reed. Vega plugged it in, scanning the screen. Dates match, he said. He stalled the truck on purpose, Syndicate hit. Ellen's jaw tightened. He sold out his badge, she said. Trials tomorrow. He's facing life. Vega nodded. With this, he's got no defense, he replied. Cole's next. Outside the hospital, James Holt faced the crowd. News cameras zoomed in. I worked with Vincent Cole years ago, he shouted. Owed him debts. He used that against me. Against Emily. Protesters gasped, then cheered. Henry Tate held his megaphone high. Truth's out, he yelled. No more lies. Reporters scribbled fast, headlines forming. James's phone buzzed again. He ignored it, stepping back inside. His confession aired live, rocking Westfield. In the lobby, Lucas spotted James. You knew, he asked, voice sharp. James nodded, weary. Not about Emily, he said. Not till today. Cole's ruthless. I thought he'd leave her alone. Sarah crossed her arms. He was, she said. He's still a target. James looked toward her room. I'll testify, he said. Give the feds everything, names, dates, deals. Lucas softened slightly. Good, he said. She needs that. Upstairs, Agent Carter met with Daniel. Your wife's safe for now, he said. We're moving her tomorrow. New identity, new city. Daniel shook his head. She's been running long enough, he said. End this. Carter sighed. Call's got reach, he replied. We need her alive to take him down. Emily opened her eyes. I'll talk, she whispered. Everything I saw. Put him away. Daniel kissed her forehead. You're sure? He asked. She nodded faintly. For us, she said. Outside, tires squealed. A grey van rammed the police barricade, scattering officers. 3 men in masks jumped out, guns blazing. Bullets cracked windows. Protesters screamed, diving for cover. Henry dropped his megaphone, filming with shaky hands. They're attacking, he yelled. Lucas and Sarah ran to the window. Cole's people, Lucas said. They're desperate. Sarah grabbed a radio from a cop. Shots fired main entrance, she said. Seal it off. Feds and local police returned fire. 1 masked man fell, clutching his leg. The others pushed forward, reaching the lobby. James ducked behind a counter, his face pale. They're here for me, he muttered. Lucas grabbed a fire extinguisher, hurling it at a gunman. It hit his chest, knocking him back. Sarah kicked a chair into the second man's path. He tripped, gun skittering away. Cops swarmed, cuffing them. Upstairs, Grant and Diaz burst into Emily's room. We're moving her now, Grant said. Daniel scooped her up, tubes trailing. Where? He asked. Diaz pointed. Back exit, he said. Feds have a van. They rushed down a service hall, footsteps echoing. Emily clung to Daniel, her strength fading. Don't let go, she murmured. He held tighter. Never, he replied. The grey van's driver rammed the barricade again, then fled as sirens closed in. Henry's video streamed live, viewers surging to 10 million. Westfield under siege, he narrated. Syndicates fighting back. News choppers hovered, beaming it worldwide. At the station, Ellen watched the feed. Cole's panicking, she said to Vega. Hayes tipped him off, one last time. Vega nodded. We'll raid Cole's hideout tonight, he replied. End this. The Fed's van sped from the hospital, Emily and Daniel inside. Agent Carter rode shotgun, radio crackling. Suspect located, a voice said. Cole's at a warehouse 10 miles out. Carter grinned. We've got him, he said. Lucas and Sarah stayed behind, helping secure the lobby. She's out, Sarah said. Lucas exhaled. Now it's Cole's turn, he replied. At the warehouse, Vincent Cole paced, barking orders. They've got Emily, he yelled. Burn it all! His men torched files, smoke rising. Tires screeched outside. Feds and SWAT stormed in, guns drawn. Hands up, an agent shouted. Cole drew a pistol, firing wildly. Bullets sparked off metal. He bolted for a back door, but Vega tackled him, pinning him down. You're done, Vega said. Cole cursed, cuffed and dragged away. Back at the hospital, calm settled. James sat with cops, spilling details. Cole ran drugs, bribes, he said. I laundered for him. Emily saw it all. Henry uploaded his final video, victory in Westfield. Protests turned to celebration. Lucas and Sarah watched the news. Hayes started it, Lucas said. Cole finished it. Sarah nodded. Emily's free now, she replied. The Fed's van reached a safe house. Emily rested, Daniel at her side. It's over, he said. She smiled weakly. New start, she whispered. Agent Carter entered. Cole's locked up, he said. You're clear. Daniel hugged her, relief flooding in. Outside Westfield, Victor Hayes sat in his cell, trial looming. His empire crumbled, a pawn in a game he never controlled. Morning light filtered through the safe-house curtains. Emily Carter, now Anna Evans, sipped tea at a small table. Daniel Carter, now Mark Evans, unpacked a box nearby. Their new home sat in a quiet suburb, miles from Westfield. A Fed stood watch outside, scanning the street. Emily set her cup down. Feels strange, she said. New names, new place? Daniel smiled. Safe, though, he replied. That's what counts. She nodded, but her eyes stayed wary. In Westfield, Lucas Reed and Sarah Miles met Henry Tate at the diner. Henry slid his phone across the table. "That's her," he said, pointing at the blurry figure from his video. "Lena Voss, found her in an old article. Cole's partner." Lucas studied the grainy image. "She's still out there," he said. Sarah frowned. "After Emily?" she asked. Henry nodded. "Bet on it," he replied. "She's got no syndicate left, just revenge." Lucas grabbed his keys. "We're finding her," he said, "before she finds them." At the courthouse, Vincent Cole's sentencing aired live. Crowds cheered as the judge spoke. "Life in prison," he said. "No chance of release." News cameras zoomed on Cole's stony face. He glared at James Holt in the gallery. James stared back, unflinching. His testimony had sealed the case. Reporters swarmed him outside. "Mr. Holt, any regrets?" one asked. He paused. "Plenty," he said. "But I'm clean now." He walked away, free but haunted. Back at the station, Captain Ellen Ward filed Victor Hayes' final report. "He's in max security," she told Tom Vega. "No appeals." Vega nodded, closing his laptop. "Cole's crew's rounded up," he said. "Lena's the last loose end." Ellen checked a map. "Fed's lost her trail," she said. "She's smart. Dangerous." Vega stood. "She'll slip up," he replied. "They always do." Ellen hoped he was right, but doubt lingered. Lena Voss drove a rented sedan, her binoculars on the safe house. She'd tracked the Fed's convoy through a contact, a lowlife who'd sold her the route. Her gun rested on the passenger seat. "Emily took everything," she muttered. "Now I take it back." She waited, watching the Fed pace the porch. Her plan was simple. Hit fast, vanish forever. She adjusted her coat, the same one Henry's video had caught. Lucas, Sarah and Henry sped toward the suburb. Henry had hacked a traffic cam, spotting Lena's car near Westfield's edge. "She's moving," he said, laptop open. Lucas gripped the wheel. "How far?" he asked. Sarah checked the GPS. 20 minutes, she replied. "Feds need to know." She dialed Agent Carter. "Lena's closing in," she said. "Get Emily out." Carter's voice crackled. "We're on it," he replied. "Stay back. This is our fight." At the safe house, Carter burst in. "We've got a threat," he said. "Lena Voss, she's near." Daniel dropped a box, alarmed. "How'd she find us?" he asked. Carter shook his head. "Doesn't matter," he replied. "We're leaving, now." Emily stood, unsteady but firm. "I'm done running," she said. "Let her come." Daniel grabbed her arm. "No," he said. "We stick with them." Carter waved to the Fed outside. "Prep the car," he called. Lena saw the movement. She floored the gas, crashing through a fence. The Fed on the porch drew his gun, firing. Bullets pinged off her hood. She swerved, slamming into the safe house wall. Plaster cracked, windows shattered. Carter shoved Emily and Daniel behind a couch. "Stay down," he yelled. Lena kicked her door open, gun raised. The Fed tackled her, but she elbowed his face, breaking free. She stormed inside, eyes wild. Carter fired from cover. Lena ducked, returning shots. Wood splintered around them. Emily peeked out, spotting a lamp. "Daniel, throw it," she whispered. He grabbed it, hurling it at Lena. It smashed against her shoulder, staggering her. Carter lunged, tackling her to the floor. Her gun slid away. She clawed at him, furious. "You ruined me!" she screamed at Emily. Carter pinned her wrists, cuffing her tight. Outside, Lucas's car screeched to a stop. He and Sarah ran up, Henry filming behind. "She's down," Sarah said, breathless. The Fed from the porch limped over, blood on his nose. "Got her," he said. Carter hauled Lena up, her coat torn. "You're finished," he told her. She spat at him, silent now. Emily stood, trembling. "It's really over," she said. Daniel hugged her, tears falling. "Yeah," he replied. "It is." Feds swarmed the scene, securing Lena. Carter briefed Lucas. "She tracked a leak," he said. "We'll plug it." Henry uploaded the footage. Lena Voss caught. Views soared past 20 million. News vans raced to the suburb, anchors buzzing. "Westfield's nightmare ends," one said. "A paramedic's courage sparked it all." Lucas and Sarah watched, exhausted but proud. "We did that," Lucas said. Sarah smiled. "Team effort," she replied. At the station, Ellen and Vega saw the arrest on TV. "She was the shadow," Ellen said. "Cole's real muscle." Vega nodded. "Hayes was just a tool," he replied. "She ran the show." They closed the case file, justice complete. Victor Hayes sat in his cell, TV off, oblivious to Lena's fall. His 10 years stretched ahead, a forgotten pawn. James Holt watched the news from a hotel. "She's safe," he muttered, guilt easing. He'd paid his debt, but family ties stayed broken. Henry joined the diner crowd, toasting with coffee. "To Emily," he said. Cheers rose. His videos had changed Westfield, a legacy he'd carry. Lucas and Sarah drove back, quiet. "Think she'll be okay?" Sarah asked. Lucas nodded. "She's tough," he replied. "Tougher than us." In the new home, Emily and Daniel sat together. Boxes stayed unpacked, but peace settled in. "Anna and Mark," she said, testing it. Daniel laughed. "Works for me," he replied. A Fed knocked. "All clear," he said. "Lena's locked up. You're free." They stepped outside, sunlight warm. Emily breathed deep. "New start," she said. Daniel held her close. "Ours," he replied. Far off, Lena sat in a cell, staring at the wall. Her empire gone, her revenge lost. Westfield healed, scars fading. The sheriff's blow had ignited a fire, but courage had won. Lucas, Sarah, Henry, and Emily's fight echoed beyond the county, a story of grit and redemption.